Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this one is a bit different than virtually any other conversation I've had in the past number of years, because this one's a little bit more personal. Um, my name's Dean Walker, and I, of course, am the host of this podcast and the little organization called Living Resilience on the interwebs. And our purpose is to provide transformative resources and support and practices to people who are bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. One part of all that mouthful of purpose is, how do we approach loss, which can also be called grief? And I'm just couldn't be more happy to have as a brief guest in this brief video, Melody LeBaron, who Melody was just kind enough really to come and be a part of one of the introductory courses we run from time to time. It's called Dancing at the Edge. And since then, I've read Melody's extraordinary book about grief, her experience of grief, and then her sharing, as she does so well, across a number of fields. You, Melody, brings so much of your own wisdom, and even more important, your own experience, which you generously share with us. And I'm hoping that that will happen today as well, in this little video. And now we've done one grief retreat, 2-day online grief retreat. We've done that last year in November in 2022. And we're looking at a couple of them this year, one coming up very soon in May. And I'm thrilled to be doing this little piece so that people can get just a little sense of what's our approach to this whole thing about grief, and more importantly, again, what we bring in our own experience that we might offer to a culture at large that just seems tremendously grief phobic and pain phobic and loss phobic, that in the business as usual world, everything's just fine all the time, and it just keep working and keep plowing ahead and override and so on. And it's really through our working together and your sharing in your book that I'm just thrilled to have you here. And what I'd like us to do in the brief few minutes of this particular piece that we're doing, I was wondering if you would be willing to share, how has your path of grief, how has your experience of grief changed you? And I'm curious if your experience of, or even how you might define grief, has that changed over the years, and particularly through your experience? I know that for me, I was kind of a typical American. I didn't understand grief and funerals and strange things like that, and there was no communication about it. It was always awkward, and I couldn't wait for it to be done. I really had no relationship with it at all. So that's me, but I'll get to them, if I share a little bit later. But I'm wondering if you might share, how has your exploration and your experience of grief been, a little bit of your path, and how has it changed you?
Well, yes, and thank you. And thank you for being in this collaboration and conversation and
Mm,
connection with me.
yeah.
So I look back on my experience before losing my mother at age 35. I midwifed her death. I look back on that melody and I see someone who was immature as it pertained. I was mature in many domains, many areas of my life, but I was immature when it came to dealing with death and grief and loss. But the process of keeping my attention on the one I was losing and being fully attuned with her, with my mother, and meeting her needs as we went along, and staying in the messy moments, staying fully present, changed me and matured me in
Mhm.
ways that, very little else has. And so I went from that at age 35 to then same thing with my younger sister when I was 40, midwifing her process of dying.
Mhm.
And probably the biggest loss I've been through came 2 years after that, when I was 42, when my son was in a car accident and died in our arms 3 days later.
Mm.
And I really thought at that point, because of what I had been through with my mother and sister, I thought I understood grief, and
Yeah.
nothing I realize now that I could have done would have prepared me for that big a loss. But when you're faced with that kind of a loss, where there's a before and after, it's like the sword of truth comes down and severs your life into a before and after. And I will never forget one of my greatest teachers during that first year after Logan died. It's a woman I knew from church. I had always thought of her as someone kind of cold. She carried herself very stiffly. And we happened to be alone in the ladies' room, washing our hands at the sink at the same moment in the months after my son died. And she looked at me and said, "My daughter died when she was 21."
Mm.
And I just said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And she said, "Well, it was for the best. She was making bad choices with her life. So it was for the best that she died." And then she took herself out of the door, and I just was in shock.
Mhm.
And I recognized that she, instead of metabolizing her grief, instead of feeling her grief, had been wearing it like body armor ever since. And there's such a temptation when we're facing loss. There's, especially where there's uncertainty about how to proceed, there is such a temptation, Dean, to just push it away.
Mm.
We can use drugs, we can use alcohol, we can use all, all kinds of behavioral addictions. We can numb ourselves to it
Mm.
and just push it away and resist it. But she was a teacher in that she showed me very clearly what the long-term effect of wearing that grief like body armor because you're still pushing it away would be. And I chose a different path with my grief. I chose to breathe through it, to cry through it, to move through it, to be accompanied through it.
Mhm.
And that has made all the difference.
I know that you and I both have studied quite a bit with one of our favorite people, Francis Weller, and a phrase that he uses quite often that I think I'm hearing you point toward is we create an apprenticeship with sorrow, or an apprenticeship with our grief, rather than some sort of reluctant, resistant, begrudging kind of walking along the path only as long as I need to. Instead, it becomes something of an allyship. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And what we're really talking about when we talk about apprenticeship with grief is we're talking about the willingness to be humble and to recognize that we are in a maturation process
Hmm.
that will mature us, that will open our hearts, that will allow us to become a channel for more love to flow through.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a pretty good segue. First, thank you so much for sharing that chain of losses that you've experienced, and the maturity that you've brought, the depth that you've brought, that leaning into it that you have brought time after time in your life, and at the most precious level. Thank you for sharing that with us. And there's one last piece that I think we both again share from Francis's leaning, and that is that uh, we really won't be able to fully metabolize this grief, these losses alone. Certainly, there are parts of it that are extraordinarily personal and extraordinarily solo, but really the fullness of the expression and the experience of grief that I'm aware of and that Francis is talking about, and I hear you saying the same thing, is that we really need to do this together, especially at this time. We're going to be doing a second brief video, this one on the more personal level. The next one is on the more larger scale, community, and even global level. We'll get there. But the way we'll finish both of these little episodes is to speak about what we're offering in through your own work and through my little living resilience community space that I mentioned at the beginning here. Hey there. I just wanted to step away for a moment from that recorded interview and time and sharing with Melody LeBaron, with whom I'll be facilitating the two-day workshop on grieving together, grieving in a flash village, if you will, over 2 days. And that's going to be coming up in May 20th and 21st, 2023. And it'll be online. It'll be from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Pacific time on both Saturday and Sunday, the 20th and 21st of May here in 2023. All the information that you could possibly want about more information about those 2 days, what we'll be doing, what it's about, is available in links down in the show notes for this video. Similarly, there'll be a link to be able to sign up. So I hope you will join us in this extraordinary time together. My experience of working with Melody, we both bring a particular flavor, if you will, to the approach to the apprenticeship with grief. And I think we're both very clear directly in our experience that this is more than just taking care of sadness that's residual in our system. That's, of course, very important and very good to do with other people. But as you'll hear as you've heard in this particular short video, and then the next one at a global or more larger scale issue level, this is a way we can actually metabolize. We can actually move this through our body in a good way, in a healthy way, rather than stuff it down. And, all too often it happens that we just have to repress it. We have to get back to work. We have to get back to life and business as usual. So I hope you'll strongly consider joining us for this 2-day workshop, which is called Hearts Broken Open. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And again, find all the information that you might need down in the show notes. So I'm wondering, Melody, if in the kind of the personal oriented brief video that we're doing, is there anything else that you'd like to say to the folks who are listening or watching, and anything you'd like to wrap it up in terms of this personal level that you've shared so richly with us? Anything that you could offer, no matter how they choose to participate or not with us?
Yeah, I just would say that loss is part of the human condition. And when we mature our own unique individual relationship with grief and loss, when we apprentice with sorrow, we do that in many ways. We do that physically with our bodies. We do that mentally. We reorient, reframe what's happened. We do that emotionally. We do that socially. And as you said, Dean, there are some losses that in many indigenous cultures are considered to be that we are unable to metabolize or fully grieve individually. We must grieve the big losses collectively in community. And that by so doing, we become mature and wise. We become people who are capable of being eventually elders in the community.
Yeah, and that my experience of what you're describing is that elderhood actually has very little to do with the number of years that a person has lived. I've met some elders at the caliber you're speaking of who are quite young.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. And so we shall see what combination of people show up for this retreat and for the follow-up program. And perhaps we can cultivate some elders in this path together. Thank you so much for spending this time, and I look forward to our putting together the next one about the larger scale, from village to possibly even global level grief that we might be grappling with in these times. Melody, thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of The Poetry of Predicament. This podcast is produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance. Living Resilience exists to offer transformative support and resources to the collapse-aware and collapse-acceptant communities around the world. Our sole purpose is to curate and offer coaching, support groups, courses, and events that assist people in expanding their core skills, competencies, and capacities for facing a troubled, predicament-laden, yet still ineffably miraculous world.